The story begins with a fight before the middleweight title contest. Many witness both sides displaying top-notch skill. Now comes the most important moment of this fight. G wrestler attacks first, which his opponent does not expect. But surprisingly, the opponent was able to defend himself and react in time. He was more dexterous than he might seem at first glance. As a result, G suddenly receives two powerful blows, and unlike his opponent, he was unable to defend himself. Everyone who saw this situation began to question who really needed to be watched. At this point, the Khan wrestler felt the support of the audience and began to be more confident. You can tell by the way they look at each other that they really hate each other. They have no pity and no desire to spare their rival. But surprisingly, things start to change. As soon as Khan began to relax and believe he was winning, his opponent took advantage of the situation and decided to take sudden revenge for the powerful blows he had just endured. Apparently, it's the first time they've seen each other and they don't know who's capable of what. As a friend, during the fight, something really amazing happened. G picked the right moment and threw a really hard punch. He did it very well. He's done a little bit of a reputation for being able to show what he can do. At this point, their coaches start to suggest how they can do better and give some hints that can be very helpful. In fact, no one pays attention to it, because everyone is focused on their work. And besides, it is not the best idea to be distracted by the coach's words at this moment, because the enemy can take advantage of this situation and suddenly strike very hard. After a while, they get very tired and want to stop fighting. But since neither of them were happy with the results, they were each dissatisfied with themselves. Plus, it's really hard to focus on one thing when there's a lot of clues being given around someone, making a remark, and there are thousands of viewers watching the whole thing. Either way, there's no choice but to do whatever the situation calls for. At this point, G decides to strike again, and hopes very much that after this, he'll finally get the win. After a while, their coach gets very nervous and yells at each of them. He's obviously unhappy about something. In their place, it's obviously very unpleasant to see a pissed-off coach, and you want to show that it's not that bad. Khan made the decision that there was no time to waste, and it would be a good idea to take the decisive shot. Immediately after this blow, G begins to lose control of his body and stops realizing what's going on around him. Due to the shock, he lost his vision for a few seconds, which his opponent took advantage of and struck another blow. But is this really where this round ends, and G can't even get to his feet? Because from the looks of it, he's probably not even able to comprehend what just happened. As a result, when G finally lay on his back and didn't give any indication that he was going to get up, it meant that the fight was over at that point. Some viewers got very excited, but for some, it came as a big surprise and disappointment. Really, a lot of people thought that G was much stronger and that he could defeat his opponent in just a few seconds. Meanwhile, wrestler Kang is in the finals. His whole team is overjoyed and can't believe he brought them this victory. 3 days until the final championship fight. Khan scrutinizes the announcement that a few days later, the highly anticipated bout will take place. The fight for the middleweight title is a very important moment for him, which he will not miss, because he has been waiting for it all his life. Of course, like all fighters, he has incredible fear and the feeling that he's not strong enough for this kind of fight. Meanwhile, some man came to him to warn him that everything was almost done. Then, the man decided to go meet with the organizers to discuss with them all the important things to pay attention to before the fight. Because in order for everything to go at its best, you need to prepare very well and control every person who participates in the organization. And not only, the guy wished him luck, to which the man replied that in this situation, it wasn't him who needed luck, it was Khan. But before he left, surprisingly, the man stopped, because he clearly had something to say last. It turned out that the man wanted to ask him for something, which was very unexpected because usually he never asked him for something like that before. The thing is, this man wanted the guy to play something, but since the request looked too weird, the guy didn't even hesitate to say that he didn't have time for that at all. Besides, there was a very important event ahead of him, to which the man replied that since he wasn't interested, he would go about his business and not distract the would-be champion, in the guy's opinion, the only good idea he'd had lately. He had heard from the principal, a man often has it that he proposes some strange business, and for some reason, it is quite unimportant to him what the answer will be. After that, he started thinking about some important matters. And of course, it concerns his future, which he has dreamed about all his life. 5 years ago, the 6th National Youth Mixed Martial Arts Tournament. At that point, he had a lot of mistakes and improper technique in his assignments. Thus, he constantly had a lot of wounds and injuries on his body, which constantly caused him to think that it was not his business and he would never make any progress. But even with this and endless comments, he continued to believe in his abilities and never gave up. Unfortunately, the coach consistently ignored his successes and only noticed situations in which he had problems or mistakes. He never hears any praise or good words from anyone who has looked at his endeavors. Every day, there was less and less motivation, as well as less desire to do something, because under such conditions, no wonder it was very difficult and sometimes unbearable for him to do so. It turns out that the very game that the director offered him is actually very interesting. It allows you to see your opponent through the glasses and thus struggle. Without an opponent, without getting any injuries, it is really very convenient and sometimes can be quite useful for novice wrestlers. This time, he had to fight some zombies that kept attacking him and were incredibly frightening. This is a very good workout for a weak psyche. According to the trainer, this is exactly what he needs to do absolutely every day to achieve some results. Although the enemies are not real, but the horror that the player feels while playing the game is real enough. All he had to do was get over his fear and ignore how bad things looked at first glance. Unfortunately for him, it's the biggest problem he's had for years. Thanks to the coach, he was able to gradually learn something new, but unfortunately it is not easy, both mentally and physically. Everything he sees in front of him is constantly stopping him from relaxing or even concentrating at the most important moment. Even in this game, he kept losing and kept making sure that he really wasn't capable of anything, just like Coach says he is, because the realization that he hasn't won a game yet makes him think that in real life, he's not going to make it. It turns out that for several years, he really couldn't get much further than level 1, but as soon as he started to think about changing his technique and tactics, everything started to work out. The coach and the guy who was already disappointed in himself rejoiced at this. But at the very last and unexpected moment, he started to succeed. Thus, he successfully reached the 3rd level, where he is required to destroy all zombies in a short period of time. After a while, the guy is at level 8 and the message is that he's one of the best players in the game. The further the better. Thanks to the fact that he believed in himself and ceased to be afraid of everything, the boy reached the 13th level in a very short time. And then he made it to 25, which he just can't believe, and neither can his coach. Thus, he becomes one of the best. He easily manages to pass several levels with just a day's time, even though it used to be a problem for him to get through one level over several months. As a result, the guy reaches the maximum level. All zombies are destroyed in all territories, for which he gets the title, Zombie Exterminator. His coach and every person he tells about his successes are very happy, because at last he is finally having accomplishments. And most importantly, he has a smile on his face, and every day after that is no longer as gray and horrible as it was before. Meanwhile, after all these years, at this point, looking back on all these moments, and he feels very pleased because he was able to achieve great successes, even though initially, no one and even he didn't believe himself. But luckily, he was able to turn his life around and become one of the best. When suddenly, at this perfect moment, he hears someone approaching him. It was some guy who was really pissed off and for some reason started yelling at him. Alex starts to ask him what's wrong and why he's so upset about something. But it turns out, according to this guy, something really very unexpected happened, and it has to do with their coach. The thing is, for some unknown reason, he ended up at Central Hospital, and apparently he's got some kind of health problem. He was now in the main operating room where Alex and his friend were headed. They didn't allow themselves to ignore the situation and went straight to the coach. Then the guys met his wife and daughter and started asking them what had happened and how bad it was, because they must surely know something. The guys tried to calm them down, but unfortunately, they failed, because it turns out that the cab in which the coach was traveling had an accident. The woman could not hold back her tears and cried constantly, for she was very much afraid of what she was about to hear from the doctors. At this point, 4 doctors came out, who unfortunately had very bad news about the situation. The first thing they said was that they were sorry. It turns out it was so serious and accidental that it was a situation that can't be undone. Meanwhile, since then, it's been 3 days, and after that time, the Korean middleweight title fight has begun. Unfortunately, after such a situation, it is very hard for him to concentrate and show himself with dignity at this event. He begins to disappoint everyone around him. From the outside, it's very obvious to everyone that he's not using all of his strength. He doesn't have accurate strokes, determination, or any self-confidence, because all his thoughts are only about one thing. Then, the spectators, who were a little more attentive than the rest, concluded that perhaps the reason for the bad movements in the ring was the lack of a coach. At this point, they started reminding him even more about the situation, which made him very angry, because no one thought it was unnecessary on their part. And it's not a good time to be reminded of such a serious and unpleasant loss. Everything that is happening now is very ambiguous, and it seems that because of confusion and lack of motivation, he risks losing, which he will regret for the rest of his life. The decisive moment has arrived, after which the winner of this round can be safely determined. But unfortunately, Khan was never able to concentrate and land any punches on his opponent. He has the last few seconds left, and if after that time he doesn't get back on his feet and keep fighting, it will be considered that he has really lost. They started asking him not to even think about giving up and to keep going towards his dream. But after losing a coach, it just seems impossible. There's no way he can concentrate on one thing and think about that loss. At one point when he was on the floor, his opponent continued to throw punches, and apparently the spectators noticed that it was against the rules. Many people started to approach the referee and asked him to draw his attention to the fact that this was a serious breach of the rules. And it turns out that it does. Kang is really starting to hope that this will help him in some way. But apparently no one cares about the fact that he's having a hard time. His friends began to take an interest in his condition because they understood how he was feeling and what emotions he was experiencing. They would really like to support their friend, but unfortunately, they will only be able to do so after this event is over. As a result, there is an ambiguous situation. Everyone is looking forward to the judge's decision, because in this situation, it is very important. Suddenly, Kang starts to notice that as soon as he opens his eyes, he has some kind of vision problem, which causes him to stop seeing everything around him. He's trying to make some head movements, but unfortunately it's not helping at all, and it seems to be the aftermath of that last punch that was against the rules. So he has another serious problem, which makes this very important and serious fight very difficult, as suddenly he quite casually senses someone's presence behind him, but at the moment, he has no idea who he's about to see. And surprisingly, at that moment, he had some miraculous vision that allowed him to see something incredible, something he had never even dreamed of. The guy certainly saw some person, but for obvious reasons because of his eyesight, he doesn't fully realize who's standing in front of him. Then, he suddenly felt the touch of someone's hand on his shoulder, which was very familiar. As this man is already close enough to be seen and his face seen, Khan turns around and finally, he sees his coach. It's really a real miracle, because even according to the doctors, he had no chance of survival. Everyone had already accepted the fact that they would never see him again. At this point, Khan has stopped noticing everything around him because he is only interested in how his coach is feeling and his health. But surprisingly, as soon as he decided to touch him to hug him, Kang felt absolutely nothing and began to feel like he was just touching a ghost. The coach gradually began to vaporize and disappear from sight. At the same second, tears and disappointment appear on the guy's face. Just a few seconds later, only one head was left of him, which disappeared also very quickly. It is impossible to describe the guy's emotions. For him, it was even worse than what the doctors had said in the hospital, for he had only rejoiced, and it turned out that he had just imagined it. When suddenly he only turned the other way when he heard a terrible sound, as if from some monster, which, in fact, it was, and as a result, he no longer knew if he could trust his own eyes in this situation. As soon as the guy decided to look to see where the sound was coming from, He saw some kind of person in front of him, or rather, something that looked a bit like him. After a second, he sees his opponent again, and doesn't realize what's going on around him. He's really having some vision problems, and from the looks of it, it's because of that hard hit. And since the blow was to the back of the head, it's no wonder he's starting to see things. But that wasn't the worst of it. Because of the frightening sight of this creature that only he could see, Kong fell to the floor and began to make no secret of the fact that something had frightened him. The spectators started to wonder what was going on, but according to the referee, it became clear that it was because of that kick against the rules. After that, Kang still keeps seeing that monster, but unfortunately no one even realizes how many horrible emotions he's experienced lately. Yesterday he lost his best coach. Today he has no motivation to fight. During the fight he saw the coach who disappeared after a few seconds. He was hit very hard on the back of the head, and as a result, he starts to see a monster. If someone had a rough idea of what it's like for them at this moment, it would be nice, because they need someone's support right now. But it seems he can only get it from one person, his friend. But unfortunately he has no right to approach him now because the fight is not over yet. So after all that happened, the judge declared this guy lost. But unfortunately, he didn't even hear it, and he doesn't even know it. How unfair everything is at this point, because it's obvious that nobody cares about the reason why he didn't have a good fight today. Meanwhile, 2 years have passed since then, and apparently the guy's life has gone in a completely different direction. There was the sound of traffic outside, which sounded very much like a delivery. But is it really? This is his new job that he has to work for, because a few years ago, he suffered the injustice and loss of a coach. But whether it's really true remains to be seen. I hate to believe that instead of his dream, his life has turned into something like this. He spent his whole life dreaming of becoming a famous champion of his field, and proving to you and everyone who didn't believe in him that he was the strongest. Meanwhile, late at night, someone is running away from someone else, and it looks like one of them is the villain that got one of them in trouble. The one in front is a famous athlete and for some reason tries to run away, but at that moment, he hears the voice of the person running behind him. He asks him to stop and says that he can't run away anyway, because he will catch up with him. Despite the fact that he is an athlete, there is obviously some conflict between them. But for what reason, it is not at all clear. This athlete in front begins to reflect on the fact that the one he is running away from would certainly not have stopped in his place, when suddenly, as soon as he gets near some intersection, he sees a motorcycle in front of him. And it seems that now there could be a sudden and very violent accident. That either of them could break in time is very doubtful. But surprisingly, the athlete was very good at reacting to this situation, and thanks to his skills, he did something surprising and very unexpected. He managed to jump over that bike even though he was at risk of not making it. The guy who was driving at the time, he had inexpressible emotions because usually no one tries to jump him on the road. And when that athlete was the only one who could increase the distance, the guy who was catching up with him got really pissed off, and even decided to push that man with the steering wheel. But that was the biggest mistake. The delivery man would not forgive such behavior. He pushed him to the floor and didn't let him catch up to that athlete, to be very fair. But unfortunately, at the same second, he failed to control and also fell. Apparently now you can see a little conflict. After the fall, it was very painful and unpleasant for them to realize that this situation could have been avoided if not for someone else's disrespectful attitude towards others. So that guy ran away from the place and didn't even apologize for what he did, although he should have apologized. Because as a result, the delivery guy had his pizza spoiled, and apparently he's going to be in a lot of trouble at work. But that's not all at the moment. He's very late, and not surprisingly, the customer has already written a message for the delivery guy to hurry up and bring him the order. But obviously that person may not be waiting for his order, because it is very badly damaged, and it will take too long to wait for a new one. The guy is very upset in this situation, because once again, he has had an injustice in his life, which has badly affected his work. After a while, he was able to accept the situation and realize that there was nothing he could do about it. In any case, all he has to do is think about the situation and figure out what to do next, because to work under these conditions, where there is no respect from the It's the worst job imaginable, and it's obviously not how he sees his future life. Meanwhile, one of them has caught up with the other guy, and it's about to get to the point where they're going to find out who's right and who's wrong. It turns out that the person who caught up with the athlete is demanding the phone back, and apparently the athlete took it away some time ago. On judging by this guy's reaction, it's obvious that he has no intention of giving him anything and will try everything he can to win, and if necessary, run away again. So that guy has no choice but to punish the athlete and let him know that he is wrong and should be held accountable for his actions. Just a second later, he hit this athlete very hard. It was a very powerful blow that not everyone can withstand. And it just so happens that he really got his revenge and showed that for things like that, sometimes you have to put up with something like that. Despite his experience in the sport and pumped up muscles, this guy couldn't respond and hit back at all. But after some time, through a special earpiece, the athlete is ordered to hit back and then immediately run away in the opposite direction. He would not ignore this advice, so he immediately heeded and began to do as he was told. But surprisingly, he didn't do it very well. From the outside, it looked ridiculous, like some little boy who'd never been in a fight did it instead. On his part, it's a very weak response, which makes one wonder as the athlete looks much stronger than he actually turned out to be. So that guy just laughed him off and decided to show him for a second time that he was wrong to contact him and didn't take his advice in the first place. He ended up punching the guy again because apparently he deserves it. But in fact, it is still very difficult to understand the situation between them and who is really to blame for the conflict. Although according to the guy with the blonde hair, it's the athlete's fault because he took his cell phone and won't give it back. And of course, as is usually the case, he got punished for it and realized that he was very wrong to mess around and take something away from this man who would not stand for it, and decided to do what was fair. His revenge looks very cruel, but even so, he totally deserves it, because he should have thought about the consequences in advance and realized that sooner or later someone would punish him and would not tolerate it. Meanwhile, the guy managed to make the bad guy unconscious and unable to fight back. Afterwards, he noticed a device in his ear, and it seemed obvious to him that someone was talking to him and controlling what was going on. Then, since the thing was completely useless to him, he just threw it away and kept looking for his phone. As suddenly, the guy heard someone's voice. It was some guy's voice, but it turned out to be the same delivery guy he pushed the other day and didn't even apologize for what he did. It turns out this guy also had the same device, and at this point, he was ordered to deal with this delivery guy. But there is one very important point that he doesn't even know about, because it's a delivery guy, not at all the kind of guy that's going to be easy to deal with. But before the conflict started, the guy in the splash page suggested that if that guy would reimburse him for the spoiled food, he'd leave. But surprisingly, they didn't ignore him and asked him how much he was claiming for the damage to the spoiled food. And as soon as he started saying the amount, all of a sudden, that guy decided to pounce on him and show that he had no intention of giving him any money and didn't think he was at fault for the situation. Everything happened so fast that the delivery guy doesn't even react, because he didn't expect this guy to act like this. This blow was so hard that the helmet flew off the air a very long distance, and it seems to be starting a very serious conflict. But in this situation, the person who is wrong continues to behave in a way that deserves to be punished and is very interesting to watch. That he would get a response from the guy who politely made the remark and didn't want to create a conflict, even though he had the right to do so, because this man has caused him a problem that is likely to get him fired from his job. Like suddenly, the delivery guy managed to defend himself and show that he didn't intend to tolerate that kind of attitude. But the guy who was attacking, he definitely didn't expect that, and he must have been a little scared. After that, he decided to remember a bit of what he used to do and answer that villain. He really deserved it and should be punished for his deed. But judging by this stranger's reaction, he has absolutely no faith that anyone needs to be afraid of anyone, or that this guy in the splash page can stand up for himself. At that moment, Kang heard some unpleasant words from that guy regarding his unprofessionalism, except that guy didn't know who Kang was in the future. If it weren't for one unpleasant situation, he would never have had to work as a food delivery man, much less be in that situation. And from the looks of it, He's going to want revenge now, and he's not going to let those words go unpunished, because the guy has no idea how much it was for nothing. Kong began to visualize all those last moments he remembered from the last fight. There were both fond memories and not so fond memories, as suddenly he felt again the unpleasant sensation he had last experienced, in the very same spot of the... He felt really bad that his life had turned into something like this. If it wasn't for the loss of his coach, he could be the happiest man alive right now. At this point, he starts to see that unpleasant creature he last saw in the ring again. It made him afraid of something and lose confidence in himself. Even with his skills and strength, will Kong not be able to show what he can do this time and lose to some ordinary guy from the street? All Kang starts to see from this point on is the same face that looks a lot like the one that ruined his whole life a few years ago. Because of that, it's really hard for him to control his emotions and at the same time try to protect himself. At some point, he begins to analyze the situation and convince himself that this is just a hallucination that he should try to ignore. And of course, he has a hard time ignoring what he sees in front of him, because it really brings back unpleasant feelings and memories of the worst day of his life. As suddenly, he became even more frightened of him and could no longer continue to try to protect himself. He was hallucinating so badly that he couldn't even say a word, and at one point, he just fell to the floor and asked to be kept away from him. At the same time, the guy doesn't know what's going on, because it's obvious that it's pointless to continue this conflict. After that, the guy gets orders to deal with this Khan thing, even though he's having a hard enough time as it is. The guy completely ignored the situation and continued to approach Kong. But would even realizing it was just a hallucination really cause him to lose again? Although after all the success he's had in his life, if he can't beat this guy off the street, he'll never forgive or forget it. Suddenly, just as he was about to run away from the place, he heard someone talking to him from an earphone that was lying on the floor and asking him to put that earphone in his ear. It's really unexpected because it's unclear who's trying to help him, since it's another person's thing. A few seconds later, some person who was talking to him at that moment asked him not to ignore those words and heed that advice. As a result, Kong still listened to him because it was the only option that could possibly help him in this situation. As soon as the guy picked up this item, he received the following request: to listen to every word and not ignore the advice he would receive through this earpiece. He immediately had the thought that he was probably being watched right now, but he still had the question of who would want to help him. Khan looked at his opponent once more and once again made sure that this was his last chance to win, at least somewhere, and show what he could do. And as soon as his opponent decides to strike again, Khan starts to think about whether he should listen to someone and how best to act in this situation. How suddenly, as soon as Kang put on that earpiece, he suddenly had strength, and suddenly the hallucination disappeared. He was able to avoid being hit. That his opponent didn't expect. Anything that happens now could significantly change the outcome of this conflict. Because Khan decided that if he had the opportunity, he should take it and not ignore it. Meanwhile, he was asked to concentrate and keep a close eye on his opponent, who could strike unexpectedly at any second. So he's more confident, and his gaze isn't as fearful as it was a few minutes ago. As a friend, this voice noticed that the guy knows the basics of wrestling pretty well, and promised that if he could defeat his opponent, the stranger would give him a new moped. Thus, he was even more motivated to punish this villain and make sure he would always remember how not to behave around strangers, because sometimes they may not be as weak as they seem at first glance. Like this time, the villain was really unlucky, because this guy had a lot of experience in the past, but unfortunately, he was never successful anyway. He remembers very well what his coach has taught him for very many years, absolutely every day, with little or no rest. So it's time to take advantage of that knowledge. At that moment, the guy imagined the presence of the coach near him and wanted to look and do what he would praise him for right now. He has very fond memories of how easy it was for him to master new things and learn, thanks to invaluable prompts and constant coaching. Sometimes it was that for every, even the smallest mistake, he had to make it a whole day to never make that mistake again and to remember what he had done wrong. The coach was constantly telling him how to stand in this or that situation, what to pay attention to, and how important it was to stay focused, because if you forget a rule for even a second, in a real battle, it can lead to defeat. And the annoying thing is that if the opponent sees the lack of focus, he can strike and win thanks to someone's. Kong forever remembered the most important rule that one must never take his eyes off the opponent. Otherwise, he would take advantage of the situation and stealthily become the winner. And if you miss a punch, you can stop controlling your body for a few seconds, and that helps your opponent a lot. Also, he will never forget to always keep his fist to himself and never let it go. He really did have one of the best coaches this city has ever had, but unfortunately all that's left of him is learned rules. In any case, it remains to be seen whether he can use all these rules and recall his skills in this situation. Because if he uses his knowledge and strength now, he could easily beat this guy in a matter of minutes. Because this stranger actually has nothing to do with professional wrestling. Which means that the winner should definitely be Khan, because he knows a lot more and can do a lot more than anyone else. Plus, he's got a great tip. He gets helpful hints through his headphones, and if you take advantage of all these opportunities, the result won't have to wait long, plus someone has promised to give him a new moped, which should be extra motivating. Thus, in a few seconds, he managed to convince his opponent that he had no chance, and it was better to give up than to try to prove something to the former professional wrestler. At this moment, Kong restrained the hands of his opponent, who was very much surprised. How was it possible that an ordinary guy having deliveries could have such tremendous strength? Strangely enough, Kang started to remember your past, and just by thinking about it, he's changed a lot. Began to look carefully into the eyes of the enemy, and stopped being afraid of something. And surprisingly, he lost the very symptoms that had caused him to see some kind of creature. And apparently it means that when he starts to ignore his fears, they disappear immediately and most likely never reappear. At this point, the villain doesn't look so confident anymore, and it seems like he's seriously starting to fear this guy because he's learned what he's capable of. Maybe after a situation like this, he will never disrespect others and think he's insulting anybody. As suddenly, this villain managed to fight back. He kneed his opponent in the stomach and it was very hard. Kang immediately stepped back a few meters because he didn't expect it to be so painful and unpleasant. But Kang also caused him a lot of pain that left him unable to speak. This bad guy gets another order to take care of this guy and go about his business. And since he has no right to ignore these orders, he decided to suddenly lunge at Kong, who, at this point, has also gotten a clue, and the guy seems to be in complete control of this situation and ready to continue this fight. Literally, at the last second, he was able to react in time to defend himself and strike back. He struck his opponent with all his might, who, at that moment, was sure that this was definitely not going to happen. But that wasn't all. Khan seized the opportunity and decided to deliver another very strong blow that would surely will finally disarm the enemy and for a few seconds suspend his consciousness. As a result, he did very well on this mission, for which he was praised by that voice prompting him from the headphones. The enemy has actually become less active, which means there's an excellent chance of finally defeating him. But it didn't end there. Kong thought again that it would be good to remember what he could do and practice a little more. The second he did, he used the most important win-win technique his coach taught him, and apparently, it really is a win-win. And perfect at this point to punish this villain and show that he could use to stop attacking those who have done him no wrong. Kang was very surprised that it was as if he still had all the powers he hadn't used in all these years. As a result, it may be considered that the enemy is destroyed, for at the moment, judging from his appearance, he is already completely unconscious. Meanwhile, Kong began to hear that voice again, the one that asked him to listen carefully, for there was a good offer for him. But as it turned out, he wasn't interested at all. Khan decided to take off the earpiece and didn't even finish the sentence. He just threw it away and wouldn't listen to anyone. Surprisingly, he really wasn't interested in it. The guy started to go about his business and pondered what he should do next, because obviously he'd better not go back to work. Meanwhile, on one of the buildings, there was some girl standing there, looking right at this guy, and there was an assumption that she was the one trying to talk to him, and was the same voice he had just heard on the headphones. The girl is wearing all her clothes black, and for some reason hiding almost her entire face. She starts jumping around the buildings as if to catch up with Khan, hoping he'll listen to her and finally notice her after all. For now, she just decided to observe him and wonder if he would be interested in talking to her, because he's got a lot on his plate right now, which makes it no wonder he's not interested in anything. Meanwhile, some person reviews a summary of an article about a young boxer's sudden lull after losing his final fight. And it seems like this girl is on the phone with this person right now, and they're talking about Khan. The person who recently researched all the information wants to know a lot more about it, and apparently wants to meet and offer something to the former boxer. All they care about now is if the guy will talk to them and what he'll ask in return. It's all very strange, because we don't know the intentions of these people, and who is the girl who is still watching his every move. She's probably following orders, and her job is to get him to agree to someone else's proposal. It turns out this woman works at the 4th precinct, but whether she's the person who talked to the guy through the headphones remains to be seen. Sometime later in some huge building, there was a man watching the whole situation, and from the looks of it, he was clearly unhappy about something. He got a picture of that villain on his screen, and information that the character's condition was at its worst, and that his recovery was taking over 6 weeks. It turns out that the person who sent her heard through the earpiece and from whom he received orders is this man. The thing is, he's a player in some game, and apparently that guy is the character that his level in the game depends on. The player has full access to the cameras, as well as the ability to control the actions of his character. At this point, he wants to do everything he can to finally bring his character to life and make sure he gets revenge on that guy. But for some reason, he can't do it at all, and he starts to realize that it's really bad. After that, he got really pissed off because he couldn't access the other cameras. Though before, he could afford to buy any opportunity and beat any opponent. Meanwhile, in some other building, another person is sitting in another building, who is also scrutinizing the reason why some delivery guy was able to defeat a very strong character. Apparently that man wasn't the only one trying to make sense of the situation and failing miserably. This man's room is a mess, and it appears to be a mess not only in his room, but in other areas of his life as well. And surprisingly, he still keeps trying to do something, but after a few hours, he still hasn't succeeded. It turns out this man is also the one who gives clues to his character, and surprisingly, his character is the same athlete. It turns out that man and this guy are players in some game, and in a long time, it was the only time anyone beat them. At some point, he decided to rewind the whole thing back in time, to pay attention to things he hadn't noticed before. After a few minutes, he managed to get to the point where his character jumped over someone's moped, causing his opponent and some delivery guy to crash. It turns out to be a very important moment and useful information for him, but exactly how it will help him is, as yet, unknown. Either way, it's obvious he's not going to ignore this situation and try to look into it. Meanwhile, the next day has arrived. The weather is beautiful outside. Khan is sleeping in his house and finally enjoying the rest he so badly needs. He's been dreaming about it for a long time, because of work, he had no way to do it. The guy worked all day and forgot about what it's like to just sleep and not rush anywhere. He is really enjoying this moment, because for the last few years, because of his job, he hasn't had the opportunity or time to do something like this. Surprisingly, even when he's still awake, the guy can't stop thinking about things that relate to his hallucinations. Even with his eyes closed, he can't stop speculating about what might be causing it and whether they might come back at some unexpected moment. And also, he's very curious if there's anything that can be done about it or anything that can be done to make sure that it definitely never happens again. And as soon as Kong opened his eyes, he began to remember the situation that happened last night with that stranger. He began to analyze his every move and thought the moment he lost his hallucinations. Because it really did have a big impact on his sense of self and strength, obviously there must be some explanation for that, where you can learn to control that moment and never have those horrible hallucinations again. But that's not all. Surprisingly, it turned out that way. He was inspired by his results, memories, and successes. So just a few minutes after he woke up, Kang started repeating all these techniques, as if remembering those wonderful times from a few years ago. As suddenly, he had a very sudden thought. Did he really want to go back to his favorite business and start all over again? Meanwhile, just hours later, he decided to head to the gym to reminisce about his past and maybe start over again. But unfortunately, as expected, he was not welcome there and was constantly told that only the strongest were here. And it's very unlikely that he'll make it a few days without being hospitalized. Except none of them know who this guy is, or that in the past, he was one of the best in the business. And after saying that, he had no choice but to answer and show which one of them would end up in the hospital a few days later. Kang immediately showed that he wasn't that weak and understood and what he came here for. Apparently, he's really tired of working as a regular food delivery guy, considering the fact that it's not too late for him to get back in the ring and become a champion. Apparently, yesterday's situation reminded him of that, and gave him a sign that he's obviously out of place and needs to remember what he used to dream about. Because if he really continues to work in a regular job where he is constantly humiliated, after a few years, he will regret it very much and will remember how he did not take advantage of the opportunity and just destroyed his and his coach's efforts, who probably would have been very unhappy with the way his life looked a few days ago. In the meantime, after a successful blow, he received the same blow in return and out of habit did not expect it to be so painful and unpleasant. When suddenly, in a very bad time, he started hallucinating again, which caused confusion and lack of control over the enemy and everything that was happening. It was the same face he saw once in the ring and a few days ago, but thanks to his reflection, he has the opportunity to fix it and make those hallucinations go away, because it's bad timing and it could ruin his fate once again. It's very interesting to see his reaction, because if he can't handle it again, he'll just keep working at his regular job. And as soon as he literally thought for a second about how he should act in this situation, the enemy seized the opportunity and threw a very hard punch that the guy didn't see coming and couldn't defend himself against. It's really unfair because if it wasn't for these hallucinations, he could have been champion years ago, and his life would have turned out in a completely different way. It remains only to understand the reason why it happens and how to get rid of it. After a few minutes, the fight was over, and everyone went about their business. But before they went home, Kong heard that guy's voice, who wanted to tell him something. Turns out the wife of his coach, who died a few years ago, is in the hospital. And that guy suggested that Kong visit her in the hospital because surely there's really no one to visit her. And then the guy told him not to come to this place again, because next time, he said, Kang wouldn't get off that easy. Kang didn't even listen to those words, for he was only focused on how to get rid of these hallucinations. They once again prevent him from fighting normally, because despite his experience, it is very unpleasant when, because of them, he is unable to cope, even with ordinary conflicts on the street. Meanwhile, someone called his last job and asked if they could get the contacts of the person who made the delivery last night. It turns out that the same player whose character was the athlete needed that information. The thing is, some employee told him they couldn't give him that information because they weren't authorized to. And surprisingly, this guy started making threats and said he had a surveillance video of a coworker hitting some guy. He was immediately asked to wait for a while, and most likely he'd be given the guy's contacts after all. After a few minutes, he did get the information he needed and learned that this delivery guy was one of the best in the past and had claimed the title of champion. The guy recognized his face and started thinking about how he could benefit from this information. Apparently, he intends to get back at him and do something bad, but it's not clear how he's going to do it and why he wants to do it. Meanwhile, in the office of this delivery, the receptionist girl told the supervisor that this situation happened and she had to give the number to this person. After this, everyone started thinking about what the consequences could be after they made such a mistake and had to go against the rules of their own company. A few hours later, some people came into the office who hadn't been seen here before. They needed to find out who the boss of this company was and how they could find him. Apparently, these people came for a really important case. As a result, he was just ignored and no one told him this information. Everyone just looked on with surprised eyes and didn't know what to do in this situation. At this point, one of them began to scrutinize each employee to see who was the boss. Then, they noticed some suspicious person who was trying very hard to remain inconspicuous. With each passing second, they became more and more aggressive because up until now, They continue to be ignored by everyone and pretend to be invisible. Meanwhile, the warden continues to sit in his seat and ponder what these people need, because surely they're here about that guy. Seconds later, they were already near him, and things were starting to get really unpredictable. One of them approached his desk, and instead of saying hello, the man asked for name, contact, and address, and warned that his supervisor had 10 seconds to do so. Meanwhile, Khan is walking down some street and can't stop thinking about how tired he is of dealing with this injustice. He's sick of seeing these hallucinations, because if it weren't for them, he'd have had some kind of success by now. The guy still has no idea why they appear and what it's all about. He really wants to figure it out, but for now, he has no idea how he can independently affect it and find out what it is. Suddenly, he's so sick of it that Kong starts blaming himself for it, even though he doesn't really understand what he's doing wrong. It's as inexplicable as possible, and it's unclear how long it's going to go on. Just a second later, he saw some moped in front of him, which had stopped, and from the looks of it, someone wanted to ask him something. This person didn't even say hello and started asking where the guy lived, by name, how, and as soon as he heard his name, he didn't even know how to respond or what to say to this person. As a result, he said his name and that he was the one who lived here, after which he was given a package, but was not told who it was from or what was in it. The guy didn't even go in the house as he started looking at this package and opening the box, and literally seconds later, he got a call from some number. It was an unfamiliar voice that started asking if he had already opened his box. Kang immediately wondered who he was talking to, as suddenly, he remembered that voice and didn't realize what it all meant. It turns out he thought it was the same voice he'd heard in his headphones a few days ago. Then the man asked him to put on these headphones that he got in this package. And right after that, the very man who was looking for him at the office showed up in a car under his house and offered to play one game. In a second, the people that man came into the office with, they started going up to the guy and catching up with him. They didn't even explain the reason why they came and what they needed as a result of this meeting. It's obvious that they obviously didn't come for a nice chat and they definitely want something, so Kang immediately asked what they wanted. I got the answer that these people are only interested in money, but it's not clear why they demand it, because before, the guy never even saw them and did not do anything for which he owed some money. Turns out, according to this man, he owes them 200 million for a character that was destroyed because of him a few days ago. But that's not all. They're demanding another million for some kind of registration to get access to the game. The thing is, there's a possibility that in the headphones, he's hearing the voice of someone who has nothing to do with these people, and maybe that voice is trying to help him, and somehow he could have known that he was going to be in this situation. So this voice advises him not to talk to these people, but it seems like he already has too little time. Either way, he's going to have to make a choice and figure out what he's going to do in this situation. The point is that it really wasn't the guy's fault. He was just defending himself and was stronger than those who wanted to hurt him. So obviously he doesn't owe anyone anything, because he could have been in the shoes of these characters who are demanding such money for them. After that, Khan starts talking to them and says that if they want to solve the problem, they should make a report and go to the police. To which he gets the answer that it can be sorted out without too much difficulty. It is obvious that the moment has come when it is necessary to make a quick choice and act in such a way that at least once he can restore justice in his life and not become someone who once again just do what is favorable to someone, but not him. Surprisingly, this man decided to offer an option, which is a game called Ranker, but it's only for those with money, and to participate, you have to hire a character. Khan is completely clueless about what this is all about and whether it benefits him to be involved in it or not. But that's not the best part. The man suggested that Khan could become his character, and that way, he wouldn't owe him anything anymore. It's all very interesting, but from the looks of it, it's not going to end well. So the guy better not jump to conclusions and think about what their intentions are and whether they are thinking about things that concern his safety and benefit. As soon as this man pulled out some object, he said, "If the guy takes it, it means the game has started. Khan is a character, and this man, a player." But at this point, the person the guy was talking to on the phone tells him not to agree to anything and not to take anything. said it so loudly that the man heard the voice and asked who he was talking to which the guy replied that it was none of his business, and if they didn't leave him now, someone would be in trouble. But it only made one of them laugh and even a little angry, because it doesn't benefit anyone if Khan does it his way and doesn't want to talk to them. After this, the man didn't continue to try to talk him down, and instead decided to test his skills, and asked his characters to help the guy make up his mind, which means Khan has to fight with them. They began to attack him at once, and were sure that he certainly had no chance, for there were many more of them, and he all alone. It's that moment when once again, you have to make a very quick decision, and hope that this time you don't hallucinate. He has the last seconds left. Khan can either run away or try to beat each of them, which would be a lot longer and riskier there. Apparently he's not going anywhere, and he's determined to get revenge on every one of them, because he's tired of having to put up with someone being disrespectful to him, and having to be blamed for situations he had nothing to do with, or someone else's fault. As suddenly, someone decides to strike him with his foot. Everything looks like he really has no chance to respond or defend himself. But at the last second, he tried to cover his face with his hands and unfortunately dropped all his stuff, including his phone, from where he could hear the clues. All these people are trying their best to hit him hard, but surprisingly, the guy is still hanging in there and not even thinking about giving up. It's very interesting to see their master's reaction, because in case Khan destroys each of them, what will he say, since he ordered them to do the same and knew he was putting his characters at risk? At the moment, it is difficult to assess their level of strength. They act as chaotically as possible, and due to the number of characters, they think they can win, when suddenly one of them suddenly walks up to the guy and punches him really hard in the face. Their master is watching, and is incredibly happy that Khan is no longer in control, allowing the enemy to take advantage of the opportunity, and throw another punch that could mean victory. And not only that, it looks like the guy is really a bit confused, and it is unclear whether he will take revenge for this act or just give up and try to negotiate with them, if he can, because they only want money. Meanwhile, they completely surrounded him and started kicking him. The guy didn't even have a chance to look around, for they gave him no such opportunity and acted in such a way that he could not resist. After a while, the person who would want to say something to him through the earpiece doesn't understand how these people dared to attack 4 people against 1. All he can do is watch the situation and hope that Kong can get free. Surprisingly, this guy suddenly decided to pick up his phone and dial some number. Apparently, he doesn't miss an opportunity after all and keeps contacting the guy. After that, he decided to just call the police and do something to make a difference in this unfair situation. But at some point, he just changed his mind because he was afraid of getting a fine, but for what? I don't know. The guy put the phone down on his desk and started thinking about what he could do in this situation to help Khan. Meanwhile, Kong continues to lie on the floor because he's been beaten so badly that he can't even get up and recover. He has a lot of injuries all over his body, and because of the intense pain, he doesn't have the strength to fight back and think about how to proceed. As suddenly, he hallucinated again, and this time, as there were more opponents, these creatures became more numerous as well. At this point, they decided to bring him up to his feet so the owner could talk to him and finally agree on something. It's not hard to guess from your demeanor and your reaction to everything that's going on that he's very happy to see this guy in this condition, because he has succeeded in pretending that he is always stronger, and because of his characters, is someone with whom you don't have to argue and doubt his words. But surprisingly, instead of being happy about his loss, the man gets angry and asks how he could have lost when he used to box almost all his life. At this point, instead of this man, because of the hallucination, he keeps seeing some creature instead of the normal person who is talking to him. He starts swearing very badly, but the man takes it as an attempt at revenge and decides to stop him from doing it. Even though the guy didn't really mean to hurt him, at least in this situation, and once again, for nothing, he has to suffer and be punished again. It turns out the man explained his behavior and said to just not have to yell so loudly. As a result, it's still unclear what to expect next and whether they'll leave the guy alone. Then, when he's lying on the floor again and can't find the strength to get to his feet, the man orders his characters to go into his house and find some money. Their master stayed by the guy and decided to rest a bit, since from the looks of it, Everything was going according to their plan. He's very pleased with the outcome of his investigation because it all turned out much faster than he originally planned. Kong continues to lie on the floor, and as suddenly, he faintly hears some voice talking to him through the phone. That person asks him if he can now hear and answer questions. It turns out, through some kind of lens, that man saw what was going on and is apparently trying to help. Meanwhile, that man's on the phone and doesn't notice. Kang has a golden opportunity to make things right and come up with some new plan to save himself and his money. He is very uncomfortable that at this moment, someone is walking around his house and trying to take something personal from him. It's just a matter of finding the right moment, but unfortunately so far, it's too bad. Meanwhile, this man tells me that it's all a game. Here's a man and this man, they're looking for a new character at the same time, and of course the two people who would most like their character to be Khan, as he is a former athlete and is the best candidate for the job. How suddenly, as the man talked about some lenses, the guy looked around and remembered the very item he had gotten from the package. Apparently, these are the lenses through which the player can view his character. It now made sense to him how someone could comment on his every move and see what was going on around him, and how it became obvious how someone in time to tell you what is best to do in a given situation. And what is most amazing is that the player can foresee the future actions of the enemy character, and thus give very good advice and hints. In any case, Khan has to make this decision on his own, because only he knows if he is interested or not. Because being someone's character probably isn't exactly what he's dreamed of his whole life. At this point, he begins to remember all those moments and realize that there was actually nothing surprising about those very clues, as he had thought at the time. Because in fact, he was just being monitored through a special lens and, thanks to the earpiece, could be told what the best course of action was in any given situation. The guy had memorized the faces of all these people, and no wonder he didn't quite want something like this to happen every day and become his way of life. Also, he still has a chance to get back to his craft and finally become a champion. No wonder if he still feels out of place, and to this day regrets very much that once upon a time he missed out on an amazing opportunity to fulfill his dream in just one day. But now, he not only has a life he regrets, but hallucinations that also prevent him from even getting close to his dream and starting over again. And what's most frustrating is that even though he's strong and experienced in fighting, because of these different hallucinations, he's become just an ordinary person who can't protect you. Like, all of a sudden, he's suddenly up to something. While looking in the direction of those lenses, and from the looks of it, he's going to want to either throw them away so no one's watching him, or agree to become that guy's character. I guess this is the moment to see what Khan has chosen and who he will listen to in this situation. Meanwhile, the four guys who went into his house are still looking for something but haven't found it. After a while, they hear their master's footsteps and start talking among themselves about how he's about to blame them for something. It was really their landlord, and from the looks of it, the fact that they couldn't find anything is going to upset him very much. The guys tried to explain to him that they had searched very thoroughly, but unfortunately they hadn't found anything of value, when suddenly, their master suddenly fell to the floor, and as if lost consciousness. The guys certainly did not expect this, and do not even suspect what happened. Turns out it was Khan who caused that man to fall, and by the looks of it, he'll never recover. You can tell from the guy's eyes that he's very serious and wants to get to the bottom of this situation, because these people broke into his house, and he didn't give them the right to do so. As a result, just a few seconds later, he started disposing of these people one by one, as if throwing them out of his house. They certainly didn't expect something like this, and didn't think an average delivery guy could handle every one of them, including the main player. He was no longer afraid and didn't care who these people were or what their abilities were, because he had every right to defend himself and his home. When the others saw how he had handled one of them, they were all frightened, but tried not to give the appearance of being so. At this point, the guy already had the earpiece in his ear, thanks to which he continued to receive clues. He was very good at defending himself and outmaneuvering his enemy, even though initially he didn't even think he could do it. Because there's too many of them and he's alone, but at the moment he's not having any trouble with it, and are very good at dealing with each of them, because after losing their main player and their master, they are not so confident anymore, and ceased to be as active and strong and fearless as they were at the beginning of the E. At this point, just as he's trying to tackle one of them, the guy gets a clue that someone is approaching him from behind. So he decided to keep that character and prevent a situation where someone would hit him on the head. So as soon as Khan looked at that guy, it was clear and obvious who was afraid of who and who would want to surrender. But there seems to be a bit of a problem because this guy is much bigger than the others, and he probably won't be easy to beat. At this point, Khan gets a hint that this is not a hand action, and some other technique would be better. The thing is that despite his success in this situation, the guy is very tired and has been wanting to rest for a long time because he doesn't have infinite energy and strength. Besides, he's alone against 5 people. Even so, he still has no other choice and has to do everything he can to avoid repeating past mistakes. And in just a few seconds, when he managed to fool his opponent into thinking he was trying to hurt him with his hands, the guy discreetly changed tactics and kicked him with his legs. Is a very good option that allowed him to defeat his toughest opponent. After just a few minutes, he was able to handle everyone, all because of the skills his coach taught him. After that, this man started talking to him through an earpiece and asking if the guy really sees his opponents as monsters, to which Khan replied to him that this is indeed the case, but unfortunately why it happens he does not understand. He only knows that hallucinations start suddenly during battle. They started talking about the subject and looking for a way to deal with the problem. So the guy offered him some way for Khan to recover his psyche and get the money. It's about a game with only 100 players. Apparently that guy is still trying to convince him to take him up on his offer. It turns out that each of the players throws in 200 million to create their profiles, and right after that, you need to hire some character who, in the player's opinion, can defeat any opponent. And when a total of 20 billion is collected from all the players, the characters begin to go on various quests, and thus, the man who, on the last day of this year, was able to do so. To be in 5th place, he'll make 1 billion, and whoever's in 4th place, 2 billion, whoever's in 3rd place, 3 billion. Accordingly, if someone comes in 2nd place, they get 4 billion, and whoever gets 1st place gets the highest amount, 10 billion. At this point, the guy remembers the situation when he found out that the coach's wife was in the hospital with a very serious problem. So there's nothing left for him to do but accept this offer, where you can actually get a reward. But just before finalizing anything, Khan asked for one more check. It turns out it's about where he wanted to start and resume his training. The point is that he wants to test how much the player's clues will help him, using a real battle as an example. Because that's the only way to know if someone is trying to scam him and how favorable the offer is. He certainly wants to believe that he can make that kind of money, but first, you really need to see how real it is. Right now, there is a very serious fight going on, where each of the opponents deserves to be in this place and deserves to be one of the best. So far, it's very hard to see who is where, but in any case, the name of the winner will soon be known. Now we can observe a really very difficult moment. Because looking at these opponents, it is difficult to understand who will be the winner, as suddenly, judging by the earpiece, you can deduce that Khan has a red helmet. Now it's much easier to understand where he is, when suddenly he gets an unexpected kickback that his opponent didn't expect. Apparently from this moment, we can conclude that the guy is starting a new life. The main thing is that he no longer regrets that he never started doing what he loves to do. Meanwhile, late at night, in the hospital building, there's a man who's been very badly hurt recently. He went to the emergency center and is the person who ended up in that place deservedly. He had his aides come to him and tell him to find this guy and do whatever it takes to get back at him for what he did to him. But judging by the appearance of these assistants, we can say that they are definitely not capable of anything now, and are most likely useless. As a result of that conversation, they never did figure out how to deal with this guy. He was a lot stronger than they thought he was. In this way, you can clearly understand how one of the rules that the trainer always told you about, namely, that you should never underestimate your opponent, works. Surprisingly, for some reason they started assuming that the guy could be found in one of the hospitals, although it was very strange because he was fine. But that's not all. One of them was also in the hospital, but in a different place he asked for help, because he cannot cope with such injuries on his own. And of course, he wouldn't tell them why he was in this place. He had already regretted many times that he had agreed to mess with that guy, and for some reason he thought that the opponent was much weaker. 3 months ago, a man was always playing sports and thinking about it. He never thought this game would prove to be as difficult as it initially appeared to be. It turns out he was also cooperating with the player who offered to cooperate with Kong. They agreed that they would split the winnings in half to keep things fair. But at that point, the player was constantly criticizing his character and wondering if he wasn't as strong as he seemed to be. This guy was most afraid of being beaten because he had to train every day to prove to his master that he is worthy of being his character and can defeat absolutely anyone he meets along the way. He never missed a single training session, and it turns out, in this way and accomplishments, he wanted to hear at least praise or words that he is really one of the best. But even during training, the player was constantly telling his character how to train better and what exercises to pay more attention to. It just so happens that the player never praises his character, but instead constantly reminds him that he's still not one of the best, and that he needs a lot more than he has at the moment, because that's the only way they can win and collect their bounty. Thus, the character constantly felt not strong enough and finally stopped being confident in himself, because of the constant attempts to get a favorable evaluation from others. So, for the moment, he's another player's character and he's in the hospital. He regrets very much that he started it and didn't choose to do something else, when suddenly, some man comes to him, who looks a lot like a player they've worked with in the past. It turns out that he brought him some money, but it's not clear why, if they had some kind of plan that made this guy make some player lose on purpose, and the one he made a deal with win. Anyway, not much is known about it, and as a result, they just said goodbye and the guy went about his business. Right after that, the character immediately changed his mind, and still realized that he had not started doing it for nothing, because thanks to this, he was paid really a lot of money. But what he actually did, and who he's actually cooperating with, remains a mystery. Meanwhile, the guys who still can't find the hospital he's in have arrived. But even so, they still drive into each one, and hope that sooner or later, they'll find it. After a dozen hospitals, they stopped believing they could do it at all. Meanwhile, one of the players is sitting in his room and he seems to have found something interesting. He couldn't believe his eyes, because this information really surprised him. It turns out that he received a message from a moderator saying that a violation of the rules had been observed as a result of monitoring, namely that one of the characters suddenly got into a fight with an ordinary person. And it turns out that the character's injury is very serious, so the fight is cancelled. But that's not all. For this violation of the rules, the player must pay a fine, 50 million. As a result, it becomes obvious that the player has a big problem, because of which he risks not receiving any prize, and even lose the chance to play on. And on top of that, there's a huge fine, panic, and a complete lack of understanding of what to do next and how to deal with the situation. Meanwhile, a few days have passed since then, which have been quite challenging. Meanwhile, Kang is in some cafe still thinking about how to deal with his next problem. And at this point, a player asks him if he fixed his lenses, to which the guy replies that he did fine. Now, he needs to register a character as soon as possible, but the guy reminded me that they haven't set up a background check yet. Plus, he hasn't given any consent yet. He's tired of agreeing to terms that are totally unfavorable to him. And to be more convincing, Khan began to manipulate the player and said he was going to throw those headphones away somewhere and never participate again. According to the player, in the remaining time, you can have different competitions. A player with a level higher attacks, a player with a level lower. It's something similar to hunting, or vice versa, a low-level player challenging a high-level player. But there is a very important rule. The strong player can refuse, and the weak in any case must agree, because if he does not do it, someone will destroy him anyway. So when the player told him all the rules, he asked if he was okay with everything, and if they would cooperate. They talked about it some more. Kang hesitated for a long time, but could not give his answer, for he was tired of doing things and agreeing to things he was not sure about. At some point, Khan accidentally learns that the player who offers to cooperate with him is at a very bad level, causing the idea that he is a bad player to emerge. As a result, he still agreed to participate in this, even though it looks like he won't get any reward because they are too far away from first place. Just a few seconds later, he got some kind of message on his phone, but from the looks of it, it means the start of the game. First, he had to push some button to start the process. After that, he needs to have his eye scanned. That is also one of the rules before starting and joining this game. Then, the system asked him to scan his fingerprint, as this is also very important. He had a lot of questions at that point, but since there was no turning back, he had to move on. Thus, he gets his character, which is himself, with the same ability and strength. First, he needs to accept that he's going to play with that character and that he's completely comfortable with it. It's a very crucial moment, and even the guy who asked him to do it started to get very nervous realizing all the possible consequences. Turns out when a guy clicked his consent, it means that the same player got him as a character. And as of this moment, Khan is a full and official character in this game. Meanwhile, they need to start training. But the fact that they have to pay money for it is very frustrating for the player. Either way, they do it to earn them. And as you know, you can't earn anything without investing in your character's abilities and taking risks in some tough situations. After some time, the character needs to undergo training, and for this, he needs to run somewhere, and if possible, demonstrate his skills in fighting and running. And with each second, the player advises him to speed up, because without it, the training will not be counted and will have to do it again. But when the character tried to find out some information, the player just ignored him because he didn't want to waste his time on it. It's very important for him to make as much money as possible and reach the prize as quickly as possible. The character still doesn't understand anything, but he understands to obey the player anyway. When suddenly the police approach him and ask him to come closer, this certainly seems like part of the ordeal, but it's unclear how to make sense of it. Turns out it's really part of the game. The guy is suspected of street theft, and at this point, he needs to get to some statue real quick. And if he is caught by someone from the police, the character's registration will be cancelled, and the connection between the player and the character will be blocked. The character was definitely not prepared for this, and didn't even realize that for the slightest mistake, he would have to deal with some complications. The police start to slowly approach this guy and wonder a little why he's not trying to run away like his kind usually do. Since they had a great opportunity to talk to this guy, they started running up to him real fast, hoping that he'll still wait for them and not run off somewhere. But since he's on such a mission, he only has a few seconds to do so. And it was at this point that he finally decided to do it, because if he got caught by the police, he'd have to risk his money and his level in the game. At this point, it's really the most important thing he has right now, so obviously he made the decision to run away and not stay in the same spot. These policemen were very upset, because they just thought something unusual had happened and they wouldn't have to catch up with anyone. As suddenly, the guy decided to talk to the player and ask if this is the easy test he promised him, which in fact is not easy at all. To which the player replied that this is not the most difficult thing he will have to face in this game yet. Afterward, the player advised him to run as fast as he could and not ask too many questions. Thus, he had to make his way among a lot of people, causing them inconvenience. The guy tried to apologize for it on the way, because he had to push some passers-by around. As a result, he was still able to run fast and hardly ever stop. But at some point, he made it to a stoplight. But is it really possible for a character to lose just because of that, following the rules of the road? The red color seems to burn for a very long time, as opposed to the way it normally does. Khan becomes very nervous and doesn't understand what he should do in this situation, because running across the street is not the best and safest option. Plus, there were a lot of police around that road, and as it turned out, in one of those cars were the very police officers trying to catch him. It's a really desperate situation, at least at first glance. Meanwhile, the cops are closing in on him, and it looks like he's got a few seconds to think of something. They began to order him to stand still and not move, hoping that he would listen to them, which was very doubtful. Then, Khan becomes very nervous, because he realizes that everything is too responsible, and there is not even time to analyze the situation. And surprisingly, that very much starts to distract the character. His player starts talking to him about some other topics, which is very distracting. When suddenly, the guy saw a green light, which finally allowed him to move on, because if it wasn't for the red traffic light, he would have already completed his task long ago. Apparently, it's the first time he's ever been so excited about a green traffic light, which is a big deal. Kang didn't waste a single second. He continued running in the same direction and looking for that very statue. He no longer noticed any cars around, people, or anything else that might distract him from his important business. But because he didn't look around at the cars around him, he almost had an accident. But luckily, he was able to react in time to avoid it, because it could have made the situation much worse, which should never have been allowed to happen. He really had a very clever way of doing it. Just a few seconds, the people around him look at this situation and don't understand where you can be in such a hurry. But since they'll never know about it, everyone just walked by and didn't get in his way. So he was able to get away from the cops a little bit and buy some time to think and analyze what to do next. He still doesn't really understand where he needs to run to, or where the statue he needs to find is located. When suddenly, Khan gets an unexpected clue, and it turns out the guy has very little chance of winning this level. Because the cops are already in a circle, they somehow manage to catch up to him and even outrun him a little bit. He again has to react quickly to an unexpected problem, which is very difficult and almost impossible when it comes to his own life in the game and future winnings. At this point, he decided that the best option was to go to the underground mall, because there would be a lot of people there to hide thanks to the large number of people. They started discussing it and at the same time thought they couldn't do any better. And there's no time to waste because the police were too close. He tried to be as inconspicuous as possible, but so far it was very difficult. But in any case, he was very lucky that he wasn't wearing brightly colored clothes, because that would have made the level very difficult. As soon as the guy came down the steps, he started asking the player where to go next, since he doesn't know the area. To which the player replied that it would be much better if he ran to the opposite exit upstairs. When suddenly, at that very second, the police caught up with him and asked him to stop and not run anywhere. Very strange and amazing that they could assume that the guy would actually listen to them and not run away. At this point, the player was beginning to doubt whether the character would be able to complete this mission. So he decided that he should at least come up with some excuse for the future. Meanwhile, a guy runs through some store, and at that moment, he hears another assignment. He needs to get headphones from this store and preferably not stop at all. The guy started asking how important it was and why he had to do it, but as usual, no one explained anything to him and said there was no time for that. As soon as he tried to go to the cash register, but it turned out there was no clerk there at all. Apparently, he really wanted to pay for this purchase. At that moment, he suddenly stopped, and in that second, the player started wondering why he stopped, to which the guy replied that he had to pay for those headphones, to which the player replied that it wasn't necessary at all now, because if he wanted to pay for those headphones so badly, he could do it a little later on. Surprisingly, the guy is still standing in the same spot, and somehow doesn't even think to remember that this is the last thing he should be doing in this situation, because the police were just around the corner, who could catch him at any second, and wouldn't even listen to the reason why he was running away. Meanwhile, some random passerby looked at this guy and wondered where he could run so fast. After this passerby saw the cops, and now it makes sense to him, but he doesn't really know what's going on. Meanwhile, it turns out that Khan left the money for those headphones after all, right on the table where the salesman was supposed to be. Kang has already managed to find a way out, but unfortunately that's just the beginning. He has a long way to go. But unfortunately, the strength for the long journey is gone. The guy is very tired and would like to rest, but if he does, we can consider it all for nothing. He began to worry a lot, because surprisingly, the cops were much tougher, which was very strange. They were literally everywhere, and now instead of 2, there are so many of them all over the street, which makes it very difficult. At which point, he receives another order to run with all his might to some station that's not that far away. He really didn't have any strength. The constant running makes it very hard for him to breathe, and he can't stop. In addition, he has no understanding of where the right station is and which way to run. Everything happens as randomly as possible. Khan only relies on his intuition and luck, if he has any, because judging by what's going on, there are some problems with that. At this point, the distance between them is literally a few meters, and every second is really important. At any moment, things can change so much. Kong tries not to look back. And that's very right. Because at that moment, he could have missed the sign that tells him which way is the station he's looking for. But it turns out that not only the police are looking for him, but also some other people. Looking at them, it is impossible to guess that they also need to run away from them. They started talking to each other and arguing about who could catch up to the guy first. At this point, it turns out they're also someone else's characters who got a clue that there's a big road coming up and a reward could soon be forthcoming. Apparently, these people are also competing and trying to catch up. It's getting more confusing. But it's obvious that they're definitely someone's characters trying to do their job better than some other character. And as soon as the man who was running behind his competitor tries to stop the first one, they see his very boyfriend, who is also who they are. As suddenly, everything that happens after that moment very much surprises each of them, because it is not clear who is trying to catch up with whom and whether these people know this guy. But at this point, the man grabbed him, which is something the guy certainly didn't expect and didn't think anyone but the police would want to catch him. He starts looking with surprised eyes at this man he's seeing for the first time in his life. The only thing that's certain is that if the police see him now, he's not going to get away with it. Surprisingly, he was able to get free. It remains to be seen if this situation will be resolved, because it seems to be in everyone's interest. But whether the guy's gonna risk his time, that's what we're gonna find out right now, judging by his reaction. They just started looking into each other's eyes, because they didn't know what was going on, as if expecting each other to be the first to start a conversation. After that, they start to realize they're in the middle of the street with everyone around them looking at them. They really are the center of attention, which is too bad at this point for a guy who was just trying to do the impossible to be inconspicuous. As a result, the man did ask who the guy was and where he was trying to run to so fast. Meanwhile, in some huge house, there's a girl who's also a player in this game, but at the moment, she's just a novice player who hasn't figured out all the rules and doesn't fully know what's required of her. She looks at Kong through the big screen for some reason and wonders how he manages to stay in this game for so long. But it turns out that she's a beginner, she tells everyone around her, when in fact she's been in the game for a long time. Apparently it's so that she doesn't want to be destroyed as a strong competitor and ignore her when she's fast enough to handle the different levels. Surprisingly, she wanted to open a hunt for this character, but was turned down because he is in the learning process. The girl was very upset because she thought nothing was impossible for her here anymore. Meanwhile, the guy's being chased by the police. They're just a few meters away. And at that moment, Khan learns information from his player that the man opposite is also his rival, from whom he must also flee. He is the very player character that girl is. After that, the guy decided to say goodbye to him and immediately ran off to do his own thing. The man started asking his player if he needed to catch up with this guy, to which he got the answer that unfortunately they couldn't hunt him, but it wouldn't hurt to memorize his face. Meanwhile, the guy gets another assignment: get his new headphones and preferably keep going. As soon as the guy pulled out his new headphones, he heard the presence of some people who were clearly trying to catch up with him. And as it turned out, he wasn't wrong at all. The police are really getting too close, and since there are no people around, that's not good. Kong is trying his best to come up with some kind of plan, because just running away from these cops, as it seems to him, you can run around all day long and not escape like that. He's already made sure of that, as he's been trying to clean up from them for hours, and as it turns out, it's really useless. Apparently, before embarking on this ordeal, you should have thought of a plan, preferably more than one. After a while, he somehow miraculously managed to get to the right place. The guy saw the statue, and as soon as the player saw it on his screen, he became very happy and even believed that they will succeed, although initially thought that it was impossible. He asked the character to finally touch that statue, and he did so as quickly as possible. Khan wasted no time, for he realized that every second was very important and made a difference. Plus, it would be a real shame if at this point, when there's really only 1 second left, it doesn't work out. As soon as he was close to his goal, the police caught up with him and wanted to stop him from doing so. But is it really possible that even though the guy made it, he's still going to get caught and have to do the level all over again? Because if this is really true, It is impossible to imagine what at this moment will be the emotions of the character himself and the player who is watching all this live on the air. They finally caught him and started talking and reminiscing about the fact that a few hours ago, they warned him that he wasn't going to be able to get away anyway. And as soon as they began to pull off his hood to look into his face, they did not expect to see and recognize that all this time he was just listening to music. Apparently this was the excuse that the player came up with. Now I understand why he had to buy those headphones. At this point, the guy pretended that he was just exercising and having a morning walk, during which he was listening to music all the time and didn't even know that the police were trying to catch up with him. But the policeman didn't even seem to listen to him and started calling for his deputies, reporting that the villain had already been caught and would not run away, when suddenly, the policeman was approached by his superior and said that this was not the guy they were looking for, to much surprise and confusion as to how this could have happened. In fact, since the deputy got to touch the statue before the police caught him, the world in this game has adjusted to that situation, and it's like there's no longer a problem, and the police caught the wrong guy. And if he had failed and been caught before he touched the statue, that supervisor wouldn't have come up and said it was some kind of mistake. The guy would have actually been caught, and things would have been very different. And since in this game, depending on the situation and someone's actions, everything that will happen next changes. It is now clear why. As a result, everything happened as it should. Thus, the character perfectly passed the training, which the player was very surprised because, in fact, sincerely did not believe that this is possible. Meanwhile, the player heard someone's voice informing him that some kind of delivery had arrived. But to hide your face somehow, the player put on a mask and wondered why the delivery didn't honor his request and just leave his order at the door. Well, it turns out it wasn't really a delivery. And in fact, it would have been much better if the player hadn't opened that door and ignored the situation. Because as soon as he opened the door, he saw a stranger in front of him who looked nothing like the delivery man. It was very unexpected and quite scary. The player regretted the second he didn't look and make sure who was behind that door beforehand. Apparently from this point on, he's in big, unforeseen, and unexpected trouble. The player saw a man in front of him, tall and obviously with bad intentions. Meanwhile, the guy still can't get to his house. He's released by the police, but before he does, they ask him a few questions, if he's seen any suspects. He's finally got some free time, at least if no one takes him away. And surprisingly, the player is still sitting in his room, though I wonder if he's been able to deal with that person. He carefully watches his character's every move, and the moment has come when he has decided to talk to him. To which the guy replied that if he had known in advance what was waiting for him, he would never have agreed to this offer, as suddenly, the player named the amount, 3 million. And it turns out they got this reward for a new record in a quest called Run. The second, the character gets this reward and doesn't even know how to react or what to say to the player. Apparently he's changed his mind and won't mind continuing to cooperate and take on some new assignments. It so happens that the character starts paying money for something he recently spent his personal, to which the player responded that he is not obligated to reimburse him for that spending. That's not very nice to hear, but it's not so bad anyway. He just got a nice reward. It turns out he made more in half a day than he made in a month at his last job. It's very nice to get that kind of money in just one day, and it's no wonder he didn't change his mind about cooperating and stayed after all. As soon as he had some free time, the guy decided to look into the character regulations. It turns out the character has no access to the account and coins. He is deleted if he has no activity for 6 weeks. And also, he can't participate in anything without the player's consent and also without his order. These rules are fairly few, but if they are broken, the character is automatically removed from the game. At that moment, he heard the sound of an incoming call, which means that maybe the character is about to get a new assignment. But it turns out this time, it has nothing at all to do with new assignments and everything to do with this game. The player is now in a situation where he needs someone's help, but unfortunately, even if someone agrees, most likely that person will also be in that seat and sitting next to him. But has he really gotten into so much trouble that he has to endure such punishment? It turns out, with the help of this player, these people want to find his character. They took the phone and are trying to call his number, trying to find out where he's at which point the player tells them that they are now breaking the rules, and if a moderator finds out, they could be in trouble. But it doesn't seem to have affected their behavior in any way. These people are not afraid of anything, and apparently won't stop until they accomplish their mission. It's obvious they won't let a player go until they find someone they're interested in. As a result, one of them did not hold back and hit the player. Because of such a powerful blow, he immediately fell to the floor with the chair. But that's not the worst of it. They decided to go into his personal computer and check how much money he had in his account and whatnot. Meanwhile, Kong is already at his house. He has had time to take a shower and is finally ready to rest and gain strength for the next day. But as usual, the day couldn't end so well. He still has someone trying to call him on his cell phone, but apparently he has no desire to talk about anything serious on his own time. This time, it was also the player's number, and so the guy decided to find out what he needed, because surely the player wouldn't call without a good reason at such a late hour. Kang didn't even greet him and asked him what he needed at this hour, and that it was the last time he would take his call before going to bed. But instead of the player's voice, he heard a completely different voice, and it sounds like it's not going to be a nice conversation at all. That person asked him for a video call, and after something like that, it's obvious exactly what they need it for. We can only hope the guy realizes that and doesn't go along with it. But even though it was such a huge risk, he still didn't ignore the request, because he realized that it was better to do what was asked of him. As soon as the guy saw his player on the screen in that condition, it was clear to him he recognized the man. But the thing is that it was the player that he saw for the first time in a while, because before, only the player could see his character, and the character could not. Apparently from that point on, they got into another big trouble, and again, it's all about the money. These people asked him to come to them to deal with the situation and get money from him, to which the guy asked why they thought he would be interested in talking to them now and coming to some place, much less giving any money. To which the man replied that if he didn't do everything he had just been asked to do soon, he would have to say goodbye to that player. And from the looks of it, they are really determined and responsible for their words. The player is well aware of that. So, he asked the character to make sure he doesn't ignore these threats. A few seconds later, the man ended that call and immediately sent a message to this guy. There was an address he needed to get to soon, or else it would be what he'd been warned about. Once again, he has no idea what he should do or how to deal with this situation. It turns out he's back to dealing with some problem he had nothing to do with. This time, since it was an unusual situation, the guy decided to look up the rules of the game and took the opportunity to contact the moderator. The thing is that in Rule 7, it is clearly written that a character cannot contact a moderator, but in case of emergency, he has the right to press the call button. But it's not as simple as it seems at first glance. First, you need to specify the reason for this call. Meanwhile, late at night in a beautiful house, there is another player who is watching his character closely. He controls his every step and action, and sometimes helps and suggests what is better to do in this or that situation. Thus, he did very well to win this round, as his character was able to defeat his opponent. Thereby removing the enemy was successful, and for that, they get the winnings, 100 million. When all of a sudden this guy gets some kind of message, and apparently it's the same request Khan made of him. The guy was very surprised, because usually he never receives such requests, and since it is only done in emergencies, he wondered who needed his help. Surprisingly, the guy started laughing for some reason, and he didn't seem to take this request as anything serious at all, and that it required any help at all. And as soon as he read the request to the point where it says that the player was kidnapped by someone, and even knows the address, he immediately thought about it, and stopped laughing so hard. He had a complete change of mood and a desire to deal with this situation. Apparently, only he can do something about it because he is a master. Meanwhile, that girl who's been watching Kang for a long time has gotten her new assignment and is heading to her moped. She was ordered to conduct an account seizure on one of the players. I'd like to believe it's about your player who arranged for one of them to be kidnapped. The girl listened to everything she needed to do in the near future and said she would try to deal with it. She wasted no time and went straight to the important business, for every second counts. In that time, Anything could happen. So she went straight out and tried to make it as fast as she could. Meanwhile, Khan is standing outside a building waiting for someone to come to his aid, because if not, he'll have to deal with the situation himself. He hopes very much that his request was not ignored, and some help was sent to this address. It would be very helpful and timely indeed. Meanwhile, he began to remember his player's face and thought about how it would be very unexpected to see him via video link. He was very sorry for the situation, but once again, he had to help someone, considering he had done nothing wrong. At this point, he's already approaching the floor where these people are, but he gives the impression that he's doing so in vain, without waiting for someone to come to his aid. As he was suddenly approaching the very place, he was met by several men who were standing at the entrance to that very room. There were 6 of them, and it looked like he could really use some help, because these people were determined to get what they wanted, and apparently they weren't going to let anyone go until they got their money. One can only hope that before going to this place, he thought of a few options on what he could do if there were any problems, because this is a really big risk to take. At this point, it doesn't look like he's confident enough to know what's about to happen, because he still has no confidence that anyone is even being sent to his aid, or that anyone is interested in it at all. As suddenly some kind of wooden object appeared in the air, but it is not yet known what it means or who threw it. It was a surprise to everyone, and they wondered what it meant, because it was obvious that someone had definitely launched it, but for what purpose, it was unknown. Kang began to look carefully in that direction, and with each passing minute, the doubts that he would walk out of here victorious increased. As it suddenly appeared that these people had done it, they simultaneously started laughing at the guy's reaction and talking about how it should have been done more discreetly. At that moment, another man came up to them, who had come obviously not to help him. Judging by his appearance, he is one of them. It turns out he came to deal with this guy and show him that everyone expects only one thing from him, and if he doesn't give the money back, he's going to regret it a lot. But the guy didn't give in to this manipulation and decided to try to defend himself because staying early, as he knows, is not the best option. Besides, given his vast experience in this business, he couldn't afford to give up and not even try to beat his opponent. At one unexpected moment, the man kicked him very hard, and it seems that Kang didn't have time to react at all, and unfortunately got hurt a little bit. He fell to the floor and tried with all his might to get to his feet, but unfortunately the blow was so strong that it was very hard to do so. The two started laughing at him, and thought about how he wasn't as strong as they originally thought, because he gave up just a few minutes later. It turns out that Kang overhears their conversation, and the person who just hit him wants to become their character, and so does their tasks to show that he is worthy of becoming one. But those people are in no hurry to take him as their character and have been testing his abilities and powers for a long time, like now. Meanwhile, as soon as he hears that he's about to get beaten again, the guy hears advice from his player to do whatever it takes to win this time around. The guy is very happy to hear these clues, and is motivated to show that everyone around him was very wrong when they thought he was so easily defeated. He began to remember the words of his coach, who had constantly told him that you should always try to think about what your opponent might do now, and then figure out how best to respond to that blow. Khan inferred from a recent conversation that his opponent has experience in the sport, and that makes this fight much more difficult. So he can't relax in this situation because at this point, the guy's dealing with a professional. Thus, you cannot relax here. You need to closely monitor the opponent and quickly react to his blows. And even better if he can be proactive, thereby increasing his chances of winning. The player started to tell him that he should not let his opponent corner him, and also, he should be more active. As a result, he's actually got some pretty good strikes. The opponent doesn't have time to analyze what's going on and act in response. But judging from the opponent's actions, Khan concluded that perhaps the man had simply embellished his abilities, and in fact, he had never played the sport. He lacks even the most basic knowledge and skills, which is very clear to a person who for many years in a row learned to distinguish who is an athlete and who is not. It became immediately clear to him that the chances of victory had increased considerably, for the enemy posed no threat if one fought him correctly and did as follows. At this point, He received a hint from the player that it was now necessary to act in such a way that the opponent had no opportunity to respond. The guy immediately heeded this advice and did as he was told. In any case, if he acted confidently enough, he would definitely succeed. Khan decided not to stop and leave no chance for his opponent to open his eyes and start acting in response. Apparently, from that point on, everyone's opinion changed a lot. Khan demonstrated how wrong they were about him, and showed that just like that, he could handle each of them. Surprisingly, once he stopped being afraid of his opponent, he was no longer disturbed by hallucinations. The player is very happy with these results, because he realizes that his character is really worthy, and he was not mistaken when he decided to offer him cooperation. But as soon as the player started to cheer, one of them came up to him and hit him very hard, telling him that the player had better be quiet. Turns out they just got tired of hearing the player constantly yelling and prompting the character with something. Plus, it's not just that they don't like it, because after their own character obviously loses, they can't rejoice and be as confident as they were in the beginning. They're looking at the progress of a guy who is showing with every moment that he sees absolutely no worthy opponents for himself here, and is capable of handling every single one of them. He is really good at it, so we can conclude that when he is not afraid of anything and is confident only in such a situation, he is able to be a winner. His mood even improved, because for a former athlete, there is nothing better than winning such a competition. He showed not only those around him, but also himself that all these years of training were not in vain. But when he looks at the player, he still realizes that the case is not solved yet. He urgently needs to think of something. And as soon as he started thinking about something bad, the second he did, he felt the same sensation of a hallucination coming towards him. He turned his head to see who was behind him, when suddenly, it all became clear to him at once. He felt the very energy he hates the most, since he felt it for the first time in the ring. It's a very unpleasant feeling, and one can only hope that it doesn't affect this situation in any way and that he doesn't get hurt as a result. But surprisingly, he was completely unafraid and even smiled a little, as if he welcomed his opponent and was already ready to fight him. He really didn't have an ounce of fear. It's like he's really happy about it, because this way he can once again conquer his fear and realize that he's capable of fixing it. Although actually this monster is really huge. Its eyes glow red and it has really big claws. He started to threaten the guy and warned that he was finished, but even still, Kong didn't even pay attention to those words, because he was ready to show who really needed to be afraid of him. With every second, he starts getting more and more serious. The guy realizes that he really has no other option but to defeat this opponent and save the player. But just a few seconds later, as soon as this monster started to approach the guy, Kang didn't expect such speed and wasn't ready for it to start so fast. He was gradually backing away and accidentally tripped over some wooden object, which is very bad. The guy was on the floor and very close to see this monster. He was already ready to destroy the enemy with his huge claws. But will Kang really not be able to defend himself, and once again he will be defeated by this horrible monster? And it turns out it's the same girl who came to his rescue. She immediately punched that man and gave a few seconds for the guy to recover and concentrate. So she's doing pretty good at buying some time and pushing her opponent away, Khan still trying to figure out what just happened. But in any case, it was very timely. The girl really didn't help badly, and you can consider that she saved this guy. After that, she did get to her assignment, so she had to stay a little longer. She needs to seize the account of the player who is in that room. Very interesting what exactly the account in question is. Surprisingly, by the looks of it, she's a really strong girl, and apparently it's not the first time she's had to save someone. Meanwhile, she went to their main and informed them that they had broken an important rule that said players were not allowed to harm each other outside of the game. To which the man replied that he didn't care about anything she was trying to explain to him. To which the girl replied that all subsequent actions would be in accordance with the rules he had previously agreed to, just like the other players do. After that, she turned to Khan and asked him to pick him up, as they could now be free to go home. Right after that, she suddenly, very quickly started running up to these people. But it was so unexpected for them that nobody knew what to do in this situation. Their chief, started to get very nervous, but tried with all his might to pretend that he wasn't, and he wouldn't be afraid of some girl from the police force. But in any case, he realizes that if he tries to hurt her, he risks losing absolutely everything he has at the moment. Because no one has the right to ignore her words, much less try to hurt her. But it seems they decided to ignore those rules after all. The man's aides immediately began defending their master and heading towards the new enemy. Except, somehow, even with all these situations where they should have realized a long time ago that they don't need to be so confident, they still make the same mistake. These people believe that they have the right to threaten even the police and think that if they have a high enough level, there are no rules for them. And of course, she was very quick to make them realize that they were all very wrong, and sooner or later, they would have to deal with it. Meanwhile, the guy watches her and wonders how she can manage on her own without asking for help. As it turns out, she's very agile and fast, which allows her to react in time and defend herself quite well when necessary. But as usual, these people have to try to find some kind of compromise and solve this problem some other way. Because it's obvious they don't stand a chance that way, the girl handles each one of them in less than a minute. So they still haven't realized that they're in trouble, and it would do them no harm to at least try to apologize, because that way, you could avoid this situation and wouldn't have to suffer so much and lose their people, which happens very quickly. Once she's dealt with most of them, there's one more guy left who, surprisingly, doesn't even think about not making the mistakes of his co-workers. He's very scared, but apparently that doesn't stop him, which is a shame. The girl immediately saw this guy and is already ready to show that they should have initially not resisted, because as a result, they will regret it very much. At this moment, Kang continues to stare at her and wonders who could be her teacher. After all, she is a girl who can defeat several men at one time. Apparently, she still trains and does it absolutely every day, because she needs to be an employee that her owner can have no doubt about. Who should ignore whether she's a girl or a guy? Because she chose this position for herself, and it seems to suit her just fine. But on the other hand, it's not surprising, because in such a position, a girl is really obliged to show only such good results, and handles even men who look much stronger than she is. When suddenly, their main player decided to make the same mistake as the characters, he decided to fight with this girl, which already looks quite ridiculous. Even with all the different auxiliary items, he still doesn't stand a chance, and it's very strange of him to hope for a win. The girl was successfully able to react to this situation, noticed the sharp object in his hands, and prevented him from further actions. She acts like a true professional, leaving no chance for those who want to compete with her. I guess the fact that she was able to defeat all of his characters doesn't mean anything to him, but even still, he still tries to get free and strike her, which also appears to be impossible. She was perfectly capable of disarming the enemy and making him unable to affect anything else. Now, he's getting more angry at her, and he doesn't look as confident as he originally did. He started to tell her that she didn't even know who she was messing with and who she was trying to hurt, to which the girl replied that it didn't matter to her at all, because he was just a player who broke the rules of the game. As a result, he finally got punished for everything he'd done up to that point, and realized he wasn't in charge, and that sooner or later not only his aides but also himself will have to answer for his actions. When suddenly, as it turned out, there was one more person to whom the girl did not pay attention at all. This is the guy who all this time, watching the player. And at this point, he decided to make an impact and thought he could do it, which is very unlikely. As suddenly, Khan also noticed this situation and completely accidentally saw that person trying to hurt his player. Meanwhile, the girl observes the situation carefully and ponders how best to deal with the situation. She begins to think professionally and reason what she can do at this moment, and at the same time, preferably choose such an option that the player will not harm anyone. But looking at that person's face makes her feel bad. But at the same time, she has an obligation to do her job and do what she can to help those who deserve it. At which point, someone not expected jumped on the man and pushed him away from the player. It's a chance to save the player and finally finish the job. Turns out they were joined by another police guy who showed up at a really good time. The girl told him so, and was very grateful that he had made her work easier by his appearance. To which the boy replied that he was always glad to help and had come here for that very purpose, for he could not leave her here alone with these people. The guy immediately went over to the player and started checking his condition, but from the looks of it, that person didn't have time to make a serious injury, and luckily the player is fine. It has only minor damage that can be easily repaired. How suddenly, as soon as the player was placed on the chair, he accidentally started to fall and was completely unconscious. Khan tried to help him and quite casually looked at the floor where he discovered something suspicious. There was a small item that is in a square paper package. He became very curious to check what it was. It turned out to be some kind of pill to take half an hour after dinner. As a result, the police did manage to do their job and apprehended the very player whose account was to be deleted. They accessed his account, and the first thing they did was destroy everything he had earned so far. In the meantime, the police received a signal that they should run away from the place as soon as possible, and since they had already finished their work, they did not ignore this advice, because they did not want to explain the details of the case to the journalists. Thus, they advised the player and his character that they should also leave the place as soon as possible, but since the player was unconscious, the guy had to figure out a way to do it because he didn't have the time, as usual. And as soon as the police left, he started to untie the player and tried to do it as quickly as possible. It's hard for him to believe he can do anything, but he should at least try to do something. After a few minutes, he managed to free a player, and of course, they can only leave. If the guy takes him in his arms and tries to get out of the place, because they can't do it any other way. Turns out all this time, the police were right there watching the guy solve the problem. After that, they also went outside and finally waited for their co-workers, who were asked to drive them to work. So they did a good job of doing their job, even though it was quite a long one. In the meantime, some service has arrived and been ordered to investigate and figure out what just happened here. All they wanted to know was how many people were here and if they were still in the building. They've brought some equipment with them, but from the look of them, it's hard to see how it could help them in this case. It turns out they each had this item and a special costume, because for some reason, they have to abide by the rules and be in that particular look. After that, the police girl went to her boss to inform him that she had successfully done her job, and his order had also been fulfilled. He's waiting for her in his office, and at the moment he wanted to rest a bit after work. But anyway, he wouldn't mind hearing such good news. And also, according to her, the violators have already received their punishment, and thus it can be considered that the case is completely fulfilled. They have already regretted more than once that they decided to come to that building and believe that they are the strongest and can fear no one. After that, the girl decided to ask her boss what tasks they would do next, but it seems the boss has long since come up with a case for them to do from now on. Obviously, it's not the best idea, but for these people it's exactly what they need, because they deserve it, and it's their own fault for what's happening to them right now. Of course, they have already asked many times about you going back and tried to apologize for their act, but it's too late. They have been warned more than once that they don't make mistakes and listen to what is tried to be explained to them in the beginning. But since they didn't listen to anyone, it's their choice. Right after that, she suddenly, very quickly started running up to these people. But it was so unexpected for them that no one knew what to do in this situation. Their chief started to get very nervous, but tried his best to pretend that he wasn't, and he wouldn't be afraid of some girl from the police force. But in any case, he realizes that if he tries to hurt her, he risks losing absolutely everything he has at the moment, because no one has the right to ignore her words, much less try to hurt her. But it seems they decided to ignore those rules after all. The man's assistants immediately began to defend their master and head towards the new enemy. Except somehow, even with all these situations where they should have realized a long time ago that they don't need to be so confident, they still make the same mistake. These people believe that they have the right to threaten even the police and think that if they have a high enough level, there are no rules for them. And of course, she was very quick to let them know that they were all very wrong, and sooner or later, they would have to deal with it. Meanwhile, the guy watches her and wonders how she can manage on her own without asking for help. As it turns out, she's very agile and fast, which allows her to react in time and defend herself quite well when necessary. But as usual, these people have to try to find some kind of compromise and solve this problem some other way. Because it's obvious they don't stand a chance that way, the girl handles each one of them in less than a minute. So they still haven't realized that they're in trouble, and it would do them no harm to at least try to apologize, because that way you could avoid this situation and wouldn't have to suffer so much and lose their people, which happens very quickly. Once she's dealt with most of them, there's one more guy left who, surprisingly, doesn't even think about not making the mistakes of his co-workers. He's very scared, but apparently that doesn't stop him, which is a shame. The girl immediately saw this guy and is already ready to show that they should have initially not resisted, because as a result, they will regret it very much. At this moment, Kong continues to stare at her and wonders who could be her teacher. After all, she is a girl who can defeat several men at one time. Apparently, she still trains and does it absolutely every day, because she needs to be an employee that her owner can have no doubt about. Who should ignore whether she's a girl or a guy, because she chose this position for herself, and it seems to suit her just fine. But on the other hand, it's not surprising because in such a position, a girl is really obliged to show only such good results, and handles even men who look much stronger than she is. When suddenly their main player decided to make the same mistake as the characters, he decided to fight with this girl, which already looks quite ridiculous. Even with all the different auxiliary items, he still doesn't stand a chance, and it's very strange of him to hope for a win. The girl was successfully able to react to this situation, noticed the sharp object in his hands and prevented him from further actions. She acts like a true professional, leaving no chance for those who want to compete with her. I guess the fact that she was able to defeat all of his characters doesn't mean anything to him. But even still, he still tries to get free and strike her, which also appears to be impossible. She was perfectly capable of disarming the enemy and making him unable to affect anything else. Now, he's getting more angry at her, and he doesn't look as confident as he originally did. He started to tell her that she didn't even know who she was messing with and who she was trying to hurt, to which the girl replied that it didn't matter to her at all, because he was just a player who broke the rules of the game. As a result, he finally got punished for everything he'd done up to that point and realized he wasn't in charge, and that sooner or later not only his aides but also himself will have to answer for his actions. When suddenly, as it turned out, there was one more person, which the girl did not pay attention to at all. This is the guy who all this time watching the player, and at this point, he decided to make an impact and thought he could do it, which is very unlikely. As suddenly, Khan also noticed this situation and completely accidentally saw that person trying to hurt his player. Meanwhile, the girl observes the situation carefully and ponders how best to handle the situation. She begins to think professionally and reason what she can do at that moment, and at the same time, preferably choose such an option that the player will not be harmed. But looking at that person's face makes her feel bad. But at the same time, she has an obligation to do her job and do her part to help those who deserve it. At which point, someone not expected jumped on the man and pushed him away from the player. It's a chance to save the player and finally finish the job. Turns out they were joined by another police guy who showed up at a really good time. The girl told him so, and was very grateful that he had made her work easier by his appearance. To which the boy replied that he was always glad to help, and had come here for that very purpose, for he could not leave her here alone with these people. The guy immediately went over to the player and started checking his condition, but from the looks of it, that person didn't have time to make a serious injury, and luckily the player is fine. It has only minor damage that can be easily repaired. How suddenly, as soon as the player was placed on the chair, he accidentally started to fall and was completely unconscious. Khan tried to help him and quite casually looked at the floor where he discovered something suspicious. There was a small item that is in a square paper package. He became very curious to check what it was. It turned out to be some kind of pill to take half an hour after dinner. As a result, the police did manage to do their job and apprehended the very player whose account was to be deleted. They accessed his account, and the first thing they did was destroy everything he had earned so far. In the meantime, the police received a signal that they should run away from the place as soon as possible. And since they had already finished their work, they did not ignore this advice, because they did not want to explain the details of the case to the journalists. Thus, they advised the player and his character that they should also leave the place as soon as possible. But since the player was unconscious, the guy had to figure out a way to do it because he didn't have the time, as usual. And as soon as the police left, he started to untie the player and tried to do it as quickly as possible. It's hard for him to believe he can do anything, but he should at least try to do something. After a few minutes, he managed to free a player, and of course they can only leave. If the guy takes him in his arms and tries to get out of the place, because they can't do it any other way. Turns out all this time, the police were right there watching the guy solve the problem. After that, they also went outside and finally waited for their co-workers, who were asked to drive them to work. So they did a good job of doing their job, even though it was quite a long one. In the meantime, some service has arrived and been ordered to investigate and figure out what just happened here. All they wanted to know was how many people were here, and if they were still in the building. They've brought some equipment with them, but from the look of them, it's hard to see how it could help them in this case. It turns out they each had this item and a special costume, because for some reason, they have to abide by the rules and be in that particular look. After that, the police girl went to her boss to inform him that she had successfully done her job, and his order had also been fulfilled.